Okay, we're live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. So this week's topic is Dutch disease. Um, and basically it's, so in 1959, the Netherlands discovered the Groningen oil fields, or actually, sorry, natural gas fields. And then they became a big natural gas exporter, and that ended up depressing all of their other exports. So the kind of mechanism behind that is the idea that it became really cheap for them to import goods from other countries, and then the other exports that they were exporting besides natural gas ended up becoming a lot more expensive. So then it became unprofitable for Dutch firms to export other things besides natural gas. So it ended up kind of stunting the development in their economy. So we're a basic income discussion group. So the question is, to what extent giving people free money in your economy can affect the price of exports positively or negatively? If you discover a bunch of oil or some other resource, does your people having more spending money make a difference in terms of your other exports being competitive? And I quickly want to kind of get into a little bit of more of the mechanism behind how this happens, because it's a little bit confusing. So one thing to keep in mind is that when goods are traded internationally, there are certain types of goods that are traded internationally. You can call them tradable goods. And then there are certain types of goods that you can really only get locally, like haircuts and stuff like that. So the internationally traded goods are kind of going to settle on a price that's the same everywhere. If you buy some kind of commodity or something with whatever currency you're spending it in and whatever country you're buying it from, it's going to be roughly corresponding to, the exchange rates of the currencies are roughly going to correspond to the different prices of the commodity. But if you go somewhere like Mexico or India or something, and you bring your dollars, you're going to find that your dollars, when translated into the local currency, are going to stretch a lot further. And that's because the local goods can't be traded. So the local goods end up being cheaper in kind of the stronger currency. So you can have currencies that one currency is able to buy a lot more stuff than another currency, and those things never really even out because of the different prices of local goods. So the tradable goods are kind of stuck relative to each other. So the natural gas and the oil, these are commodities that are traded internationally. So if you are a country that's exporting a lot of natural gas or oil or some other resource like diamonds or something like that, then what you're going to end up seeing is that your currency appreciates relative to the other currencies in the world. So, wherever you are, you're going to buy oil for the same price. But since you're an oil exporter, oil is relatively cheaper compared to other goods. So that ends up making it profitable for people to move into service industries, and if you go to Norway, they might have higher prices for local services, local goods and services and stuff like that. And then that ends up, because the currency has appreciated, that makes it less profitable to export other goods, because now your exports are going to be more expensive if they're not the main export that's kind of like driving the currency appreciation. So that's kind of like an overview of the overall phenomenon. And I'm kind of new to this, so I might have messed it up a little bit. But I want to. So when we're thinking about how this interacts with basic income, now you're giving everybody more money. And one of the main kind of downsides of Dutch disease that people talk about is that it eliminates jobs. So if other industries are not able to compete, then people who had jobs in those industries lose their jobs. So that part of it is maybe not as big of a deal if you have something like a basic income in place. But maybe you still want your economy to be diversified. You don't want to be dependent on one single export because if the price of oil crashes, as it does sometimes. We saw that as recently as last month. then you want to still be able to buy things for your people. If your entire economy is exporting oil and then all your people are just buying imports all the time instead of buying stuff locally, then your economy doesn't know how to produce stuff locally. So that's a potential danger there. So just kind of seeding those initial thoughts there, I want to get people's ideas on, you can pass if you want to, but ideas on how basic income might interact with this kind of issue, this kind of Dutch disease or resource curse, so to speak. So we'll go through in the same order. So we'll do Derek and Nick and then Soraya.
I mostly want to hear from you guys on this one. I still need to get my head around it. I guess I'm interested to learn to what extent is this a phenomenon that's, this seems to rely on a foreign currency from one that's more valued coming into an economy that's less valued. So it sort of presupposes that relationship to begin with. And I wonder if there's anything, is there any sort of analogy that happens in a large country domestically, like between states with using a single currency? Or is this really just something that can only happen when we're talking about two different types of money mingling together? So I kind of want to just hear more about this before I weigh in too much.
Yeah, that's a great question. To what extent you can have similar effects domestically in the same currency zone. So let's go to Nick, Soraya, and then Zach.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I don't have much intuition about how it's really going to go. I mean, one thing we've talked a bunch about is the idea that if you have a basic income that's really high enough that it really gives people a choice whether to, really gives people the freedom to say no to, jobs that aren't rewarding, then I think it's hard to predict. I mean, but it might be that if in a country that had a resource curse, but and that freed up a lot of people from having jobs, and that country had some entrepreneurs who could figure out how to produce things in a way that was so fun for people that they could hire people to help them do it for really cheap, then maybe that would counterbalance some of this effect. I'm interested in trying to think that through.
Yeah, interesting thoughts. So let's go to Soraya and then Zach and then Richard.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex, because I read the article and I was like, how does this relate? And now I'm seeing the correlation. Yes, there will be less jobs, but there is more value put on like local things. And this is my thought. However, like if we think about like our current society, and again, I'm a social worker, so not I feel like.
So your audio is breaking up a little bit again. Soraya.
Oh, can you guys hear me now or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm not moving. So it makes me think like, will the quality of public goods go down? And then we see a rise in prices of private things, such as like, say, for example, like schooling. So now because no one has a choice, or like if you think about like East Germany, like everyone has housing, everyone has that basic housing. But then now like the divide between getting that free basic housing versus getting like, what you actually want, like a house or your own choice, is so high. And then now if jobs decrease, people, yes, good, they can participate in more leisure activities, but now they have less. Think about people who like didn't have the opportunity to like go to school, get a college degree, like access those better jobs. Now how do they get more capital? How do they get more money? Because everyone's just starting with this. So yeah, trade-offs.
Cool. Zach, Richard, and then Steve.
So I did a little bit of research on this, and the worst case scenario of Dutch disease is kind of like Venezuela, where the entire economy is based off of oil, and then oil tips a thing and everything goes to kaput. And then the best is Norway, where they just saved the money. They were a person who won the lottery, kept their day job, and invested in the stock market. Anyway, so the real key to how universal basic income is, does it destroy so much jobs that you lose the production that the universal basic income is based off of? And I thought that was a really interesting idea, and how you kind of figure it to, because universal basic income will discourage people from working, but universal basic income is based off of people working. So it's a very interesting dichotomy.
I love it. Let's go to Richard, Steve, and then Martin.
Well, one way that countries get around it, like in the US, they have to have a certain percentage of a car being made in the US. So that means that you have to have jobs in the US in order to import and to produce your car here or sell it here. And another way Ecuador is another resource exporter with oil, and they have their currency based on dollars, so that it remains stable, and they don't have to have. They're entirely reliant on the Federal Reserve determining the value of their currency. And if you have a basic income instead of having like make work jobs or whatever, then that frees up people to pursue entrepreneurship, and since everyone else has money, they can spend money at their bakery or whatever. So, and you can expand your bakery to franchise it or something, and then other people will be able to buy shares or something like that.
Cool. Let's go Steve, Martin, and then Mitchell.
I'm going to try to explain how I think of how currencies change value. So some people want to buy, say, Norwegian oil. Well, the first thing they have to do is they have to buy Norwegian currency to pay for Norwegian oil. So there's a lot of interest in Norwegian oil, and there's a lot of interest in buying Norwegian currency. There's a lot of demand for the currency. And so as usual, when something's in demand, its price goes up. So actually the foreign exchange rates, to me, are just another example of supply and demand. If the people want the oil, then they bid the currency up. But this newly strengthened Norwegian currency, it applies to all exports. The oil is happy for the Norwegian currency to go up, but they need the same Norwegian currency to buy all the other exports that were having trouble competing. So now, as the Norwegian currency goes up, all the other Norwegian exports will have trouble competing. So that's how I think of it.
I like that. That's a really good way of explaining it, and probably better than my explanation that I gave just a minute ago. Thanks, Steve. Let's go Martin, Mitchell, and then Eddie.
So on a couple of people have mentioned, or someone mentioned, the resource curse. And so resource curse is really not quite the same thing as Dutch disease. And so, Alex, I think you've sort of elucidated the Dutch disease, but there is the possibility that where you have if you will, a Dutch disease scenario, you can also have a resource curse scenario. So the idea of even a commodity such as oil being able to fund a universal basic income, if elites in the producing nation capture the rents from the resource, then then there isn't that sharing or that basic income. So there is the specific challenge of Dutch disease type scenarios of the corruption involved in rent capture. I suppose my other thought on it, because I've mentioned I'm sort of a Soviet guy from my education and tend to follow those things a little bit. Early in the Putin leadership era, I think there was an intention to diversify the Russian economy, right? It went from commune instant, and there was shock therapy and blah, all the rest of it for anybody who follows that stuff. But there was a stated goal to diversify the economy, and that hasn't happened, and it even looks less likely to happen. And so you have a pretty good example of the Dutch disease at work, even in a country that wanted, had a leader who's still in power and, obviously pretty firmly in power, no matter how else one wants to sort of look at him, but was not able to diversify the economy. You have the example of Norway that somebody else has pointed out. That really does seem like a positive example, but you can sort of string up a few more examples of where it doesn't work out that great.
Yeah, it's an interesting question why it's so hard to get this right. Is there not like a playbook that we've developed or that kind of thing where if you just follow these simple steps, then you can do it or something like that. So let's go to Mitchell, Eddie, and then Bethany.
I'll pass this time just due to the paywall. I didn't read the article.
Sorry about that. Let's go to Eddie, and then Bethany, and then Joan.
So I think there's there's two different aspects here. One aspect is the specialization aspect, which I think, like Derek pointed out, you would be able to see even within a single currency. For instance, within the US, if you looked at a rural area versus a very expensive city area. And so for the city area, you'll see a lot of prices be a lot higher, and a different specialization of the economy for what you do in the city versus what you do in the rural areas. And then the second aspect, which I think is the more interesting one, is there is a currency or foreign exchange policy aspect here. So the question is, how does the market, how is your currency valued versus other currencies in the world? How is it valued on the market, and how much or whether the central bank or the government tries to intervene on this value? And with the currency or foreign exchange policy, there's a certain amount of similarity to monetary policy, where you can basically have easing. For instance, if the central bank sets the interest rates lower, that is an easing of the economy internally, and it also has the effect of tending to depress the value of the currency, which is also easing for the economy. It makes the currency cheaper, which makes it cheaper to export things, which tends to allow businesses to do more business through easing. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, those are great points. And it's interesting how the lower interest rate causes the currency to depreciate. And as long as the interest rate is staying lower than interest rates in other currencies, then the currency will kind of continue to depreciate. So you've got this effect of the exports, which is kind of like a change in the level of the currency relative to another currency, and just kind of stays there. Whereas if you keep interest rates depressed, that can kind of keep the currency depreciating, because people want to if they want to save money, they'll buy the currency that provides the higher interest rate. They'll just change their currency into one where this is called the carry trade, right? And Eddie, you're probably familiar with this, but for everyone else,
yes.
You have your currency, and then you change it into an asset that's in a currency with a much higher interest rate, and then you just change it back when you need it, and that way you get a higher return than if you had just invested kind of in your own currency. So certainly the lower interest rates you can kind of use that to get your currency where you want it to be, to some extent, relative to other currencies. So let's go Bethany, and then Joan, and then Austin.
Okay, so I guess first I'm still trying to make sure that I understand like the key insights of Dutch disease, which I think Steve also helped me understand a little bit, but um, and I don't know which ones are kind of most relevant to our discussion, but it sounds like what happens is that not only is it really profitable to export this particular thing, but that kind of bids up your currency and makes it more expensive to export other things. So it's kind of like dual. I mean, there's this general intuition that it's profitable to do it, but it also harms the other ones in a way. Yeah, so that's interesting. And then in terms of basic income, it's well, I guess there's the question of first of all, is there anything you can do to combat this, which is kind of what Martin was raising, like how often are countries actually able to do it? But if you could combat it, one way you might do that is by having like exporting capacity that might seem a little bit redundant in terms of what's efficient as kind of a hedge against things changing in the future and the export, like oil prices crashing or whatever the export is, not being as profitable. And the way I see that connecting to basic income is like, as I think Zach raised, you want to have the basic income at the right level so that you're not discouraging the labor that you do need. All of which is to say, like, if you need to have kind of a somewhat present term inefficient like exporting capacity, you need more labor, right, to kind of maintain that. And so that would be something that would maybe slightly lower the level of basic income so that you could incentivize enough people to kind of like keep capacity going. So I guess Dutch disease kind of like creates an incentive to do that for countries that would otherwise be like tempted by a particular export. That's kind of long-winded, but that's the connection I guess I see with basic income. And if you're even able to do that, as Martin was pointing out, to make that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I think by adding the redundancy, by saying we want to maintain this capacity to do other stuff, and by having the government put resources into that, you're lowering the level of basic income that your economy can sustain in the present. But maybe you're preparing so that you don't have so much volatility in the future, and you can be more robust and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess it's
like that a
similar to
lot.
like what we've talked about with climate change or other things, where you might want to make things less efficient in the short term for long-term gain.
Yeah, something like a carbon tax, that might reduce the level of basic income you can afford, but it helps you conserve carbon. So maybe the resource you're conserving is like the diversified productive capacity of your economy or something like that. Yeah, I like that. So let's go to Joan and then Austin.
Okay, I only have one question. I'm pretty confused. So the one question I have has to do with something Bethany just said and other people have said about lowering the ability of the economy to provide basic income. So we're not talking about printing money anymore, I guess.
I think we're just in the back of our heads assuming that you're printing money to fund the basic income.
In which case, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is that your economy can handle a certain level of consumer spending, and if you're employing people redundantly, then maybe that makes your economy less productive in the present, instead of if you were just specializing in just exporting the oil. So if you're just exporting the oil, you could pay the basic income, and then people could spend their basic income importing things from everywhere else, and your country produces nothing but the oil. So that can lead to maybe your economy is a little more fragile. If the price of oil crashes, now people won't be able to just spend their basic income on imports anymore because nobody wants to buy the oil anymore.
And they're not buying stuff in the country because all the jobs and whatnot are going toward oil production.
Yeah, and all the production in the economy is just going towards oil. So you're not buying it in your domestic economy because it's cheaper to just buy imports. Like for us, there's all the talk of, don't buy Chinese goods, buy American goods and stuff like that. So you can imagine, hey, we're happy to buy all this Chinese stuff, and America just doesn't know how to produce anything anymore. And maybe that's fine as long as we can keep that up forever. But maybe it's not fine if there's some risk that we won't be able to keep buying stuff from China. So if what allows you to buy stuff from China is that you're exporting a ton of oil all the time, and then suddenly the oil well runs dry or the price of oil crashes, then you run into a problem.
And you've given up your ability for your own economy to produce these things.
Yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened in Venezuela. Venezuela,
Right.
you know,
Right.
kind of Zach was bringing up Venezuela. You know, their economy just got so over specialized. They didn't even know how to produce their own food anymore.
Yeah. Oh,
And there
wow.
was more going on there than just Dutch disease. There was also, you know, price controls and, you know, governments taking over any industry and then making it inefficient and stuff
Right.
like that. But yeah, I mean, they when the price of oil crashed in 2014 or whatever, they didn't really have any recourse because they couldn't produce their own stuff anymore.
Right. Just one other thing, and that's the comparison, or maybe there isn't any, but in my mind, I'm thinking about Alaska. They're giving a dividend to their citizens as a result of oil production, and that seems to work. So why does that work?
Well, it depends what you mean by work, right? So what allows so there are a few issues with the Alaska system. So what allows what allows the economy, what allows the consumers to spend is that there's something for them to buy in kind of like the whole American economy, and then Alaska is able to actually directly fund those consumers
Yeah.
because they're selling the oil. Like Alaska can't really print their own money. But if they were allowed to, they could, the basic income would work fine there. Now, if the oil runs dry, they're not going to be able to do it. And then there's issues where if their spending is constrained by revenue, it's constrained by the oil revenue, then you have a problem where now you have a certain amount of money that you're raising that's kind of coming into your government budget. And maybe they do diversify it. They don't just spend the oil money. They have this fund that they invest in, and it's more diversified and stuff like that. But it is still kind of like a limited amount of money. So if you're spending it on the oil dividend check, then that's money you're not spending on other things. So there's a lot of people who are frustrated because Alaska isn't providing a lot of the infrastructure they need in like schools and roads and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So there's kind of a trade-off there.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're spending it, they're giving it away as a dividend, but Norway is saving it.
Yeah. So Norway, I think both of them are saving it, right? So they've invested in these funds, and then they're using the revenues from the funds to actually fund the programs.
Okay.
So in Alaska, that's a dividend that goes to everyone, but that's not the only thing they do with the oil
Right.
fund. They do other things too.
Okay.
And then in Norway, they fund various social programs and government programs and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. So let's go to Austin.
Hey guys, I've got a few I don't really understand this that well, so I've got a few little questions that are sort of bubbled up. One thing that I thought is, well, if it's bad for other exporters, it's probably good for importer businesses. So if you're running a bookshop or a toy shop or something and you want to sell goods, having the currency effect makes importing cheaper. And I would also add, I think that the US probably has the currency effects of Dutch disease because the global markets for oil are in US dollars, even though I don't know what US is as an oil producer or importer at the moment. I would say as well that in Australia, we had a version of this with when there was the minerals boom for iron ore and stuff like that. And I would say whatever we did, we seemed to get more the resource curse, where the resource, which I think is to do with political effects, where our relationship with China became very complicated as a result of this intense trading relationship. And I would suggest that a lot of the resource curse that I've read about in the past is actually about the becoming the focus of the attention of foreign powers, which I think is also relevant to Venezuela. Like, as you said, it's complicated by a lot of things that the Venezuelan government was doing. It's also complicated by a lot of stuff that foreign governments were doing. So I think it's really tricky to use Venezuela as an example because the causality there is really difficult to establish because there's a lot of actors and, there's narco traffickers and Colombian mercenaries and this, Blackwater guy who just got arrested there or whatever. I'd say in relation to the basic income, I think there's sort of two questions that I can think of. Would basic income be a sort of simulated Dutch disease, right? Is one of the questions that needs addressing. And would it have the same similar distorting effects on prices and jobs, or how are those effects differently? on the other side, is basic income a good use of resource wealth, or is it a good response to Dutch disease? So those are sort of overlapping questions. And yeah, that's sort of my starting position of what I'm trying to figure out here.
Cool. Yeah, those are great questions, and I like that you brought up the United States potentially suffering from a Dutch disease of exporting dollars, and this is related to an article that Steve shared in the Facebook group, where they make precisely that argument that the United States, our biggest export is the dollar system itself, and that because we can just keep sending dollars away, kind of like on their own, like we don't need to, have some kind of actual physical commodity that we're exporting the dollars, and people just want to accumulate dollars because that's what makes the other countries financially stronger, is to accumulate dollars. So we have kind of this thing where we're printing dollars and sending them away, and that makes imports really cheap, and we have a trade deficit, and it makes it more expensive for us to export stuff to other countries. So is that a form of Dutch disease? And I would say that there are some things that are related, like some of those effects are similar. But one of the biggest problems with Dutch disease also is that you're often depending on a resource whose price might be very volatile. So like I was saying before, if suddenly the oil well dries up, then you're in trouble. If the price of oil crashes, then you're in trouble. If what we're exporting is the dollar, and that's kind of like a very stable thing, then maybe you have less of that risk. But it's still something worth paying attention to, because there's nothing guaranteeing that the dollar is going to stay at the top of the world currency hierarchy, and that internationally everyone's going to keep using the dollar system and stuff like that. But if that is a stable situation, then maybe that's kind of a little bit of a free lunch for us. We can keep buying imports and exporting our dollars, that kind of thing. So I like that you brought that up. So in the chat, Sarai was asking whether it's a trade-off between giving people money and providing public services. So I would say that's the case in a place like Alaska, where their spending is dependent on their revenue. It's not something that's generally true about, well, yeah. So it is something that's true about basic income. But it's not about the limited revenue that the government gets. It's about what resources are available in the economy, and which resources do we want to allocate directly through the government, and then which resources do we want to allow to be allocated by the market. So the more resources that you want the government to allocate, that reduces the amount of consumer spending that can go into the market. So that reduces the amount of basic income you can have. So there's a trade-off here, but it's not the same trade-off that Alaska is making, where they have like a specific amount of dollars and they have to decide where the dollars are going to go. Yeah, it's not one-to-one, dollar for dollar, when you're thinking about it at the level of the federal government or the currency issuer. And I like so Zach has a comment in the or you can just say your comment if you want, Zach.
I was just saying that it's more of a thing with, I don't even remember what I said. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you said it's more of when a currency appreciates, which causes problems, and a government has more money to spend. How can they mitigate the problems caused through government spending?
That sounds really good.
Yeah, it does sound good. So this question is more, if you have this kind of centralized, point of control where you've got this resource and the government is controlling it, how do you make sure they manage it responsibly? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that's a tricky thing, and I think that's something that Norway figured out, and something that a lot of other countries haven't figured out, because it's hard to get the incentives right when you've really got this kind of single point of failure, single point of control. How do you prevent corruption, that kind of thing? So I think that's kind of one of the biggest problems with Dutch disease. Bethany, go ahead.
I just had a quick follow-up to Sarai's question, because I think it might not be clear. So I think that there's this question of whether the government or the society is already making the most of the economic potential. And so I think, for example, you generally have this view that we are not yet doing that. And so if you're in that state, then it's not just zero sum between, say, basic income and other government services. You might be able to increase both. But then if you imagine getting to the point where you're kind of using as much of the capacity of the economy as you would want to use, that's the point at which I think you would view it as more of a zero-sum trade-off. So I just wanted to specify that in terms of like the current state of things, you would actually not say that those things necessarily are zero-sum with each other, like services
Yes.
and basic income. But in the sort of ideal world where we've maximized things, they become traded off with each other. So I just wanted to
Yes.
clarify that because I think
Yes,
that's important.
that's exactly right. We could absolutely have a much higher basic income right now and much higher, better, cheaper public services. We can have both of those things. Once we get to the point where we've kind of maxed out what we can get, then we have to start making trade-offs. But we don't have to make those trade-offs right now. And Alaska is in a specific situation where they're revenue constrained, so they already have to make trade-offs, and it's a dollar for dollar trade-off.
Right.
That's different from the kinds of trade-offs that we would be making if we did basic income at the level of the whole country.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Bethany.
Just want to clarify that. Yep.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to get to Derek's point about whether you'd see any of these kinds of effects within a country that uses the same currency. So there's something called the pen effect, which is this idea that there can be different price levels in different places. And I was talking about that before, where you have countries with different currencies, and then the price level of you can kind of equalize along the price level of the tradable goods, and then the local goods can be higher or lower in different current countries. So you have different price levels when you translate into the different currencies. So the exchange rates don't match the price levels perfectly because of the different local goods. So you can have exactly that same effect within an economy that's all using the same currency. And someone brought up that you might have rural areas or cheaper cities in the United States. So you actually, we talk about the general price level and the purchasing power of the dollar, but that's different depending on where you go in the United States. And that's the pen effect. And it's the same thing. You have these local goods and services that aren't really tradable across and between regions. And that's where the price differences show up. So even within a single currency, you can have different price levels in different places. So it's the exact same thing. Yeah. Let's see. Anyone have any more comments? Yeah, Bethany.
Sorry, can you clarify one more time? I think you just said it, but the way that this international trade, let's go back to that example, like affects the motivation to start like a local business or to invest or to spend money on local things. I know you've explained it a couple of times, but I'm still a little bit confused about it.
Yeah, so if you have so tradable goods are always going to be the same price, or not always, but they're going to kind of tend towards being the same price. And you just, if you have an exchange rate between two different currencies, you switch into a new currency, and whatever amount of steel you were able to purchase before, you purchase the same amount in the new currency because you just switched your dollars into yen or something like that. It buys the same amount of steel. But if you actually go to Japan, the local prices might be different. So what happens with the Dutch disease is that you've found a tradable good that you can export a lot of. So it has to be the case. You might think that would just push down the price of that exported good in your economy, and everything would kind of even out. But since it's a tradable good, it has to be the case that the price of that good has to stay uniform in the international economy across international trade. So instead of the price of oil going down in your economy or in the international economy, the price of your local goods have to go up, relatively speaking. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So,
Yeah.
and not only do the price of your local goods have to go up, but the prices of your other export, it becomes, because your currency appreciates, it gets less profitable to export other things besides the oil. Right, your currency is going to appreciate relative to other countries because you're exporting all this oil, and exactly what Steve was talking about, that people want to buy the oil. So they're trading into, if you're Norway, they're trading into the Norwegian krona, right? So that drives up the krona internationally, and there's nothing that's going to cause it to come back down again and even out, because the price of oil is the same everywhere.
So that makes sense in terms of why things in Norway or wherever are more expensive than things in another country. like if you were to travel, for example. But I guess you also seem to suggest that like this would change the incentives of what people do within Norway. I guess I'm not, is that just because they're not exporting, so they might as well do local services, or was there something more?
Well, the currency is
that.
appreciated. That means that if you live in Norway, you can buy imports from other countries much cheaper. So you're going to prefer to do that instead of buying buying tradable goods locally. So you end up spending on local goods locally and importing everything else.
Yeah, I guess, does it stimulate local goods, or do they they're just kind of like what's left? Does that make sense?
I think it stimulates local goods. It certainly drives up the prices of local goods. I think there's, generally local goods are maybe not as scalable as some of these other like manufactured goods and stuff like that can be tradable. So generally people have more money to spend on local goods. So you probably see more of a price increase than kind of a production increase. Because these are kind of like lower productivity areas.
And the imports are getting cheaper. So I would find that like less of my income has to go to things that I buy from China on Amazon, and more goes to like the haircuts, which are now more expensive.
Yeah, or fancy restaurants or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry to take up too much time. I don't know if that's super relevant, but I was trying to understand that.
No, that's a big part of it. Let's go to Austin.
In that regard, I think the Australian experience has something to offer, because one of the things that it's slightly different because it was a really rapid boom. So the iron ore was all there, then the price went through the roof. So all of a sudden you have all this diversion of economic activity from nationwide. You had all the engineers and people with heavy machinery licenses all of a sudden going to the northwestern part of of the country, where so it became harder for construction and other industries and farming and so on to get certain skills and machinery and stuff like that, right? A lot of the people who would have been working on farms were instead in mines and so on. So it hurt other producers, it hurt construction, all that kind of stuff. And then you have the local effect there, where these people arrive who are on these really high salaries, and all of a sudden they can pay $10 for a beer and the locals can only pay $5. The locals who don't get in on the action, housing prices go through the roof and you're paying $1,000 a week for a demountable thing like that. And so if you're trying to maintain, just live in your house, right? All of a sudden, and you don't own it, if you're just renting there, that becomes really difficult. So there's consumption and production effects, but I think, and in both cases, it makes it hard for other people to buy. It's the resource sector can outspend everybody else. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
That's the other thought was the rate of change really matters. If like with Norway, it's there permanently, and oil fluctuates, but it didn't fluctuate as wildly as so. What happens is the price of extraction was higher than the cost, then it wasn't. So it sort of turned on and off this industry in Australia, which had made it even worse.
Right. And to some extent that can be mitigated by kind of diversifying the investment and having like the sovereign wealth fund kind of thing that Norway has. And I'm not sure, I think Australia has something similar, but maybe it was so volatile that it didn't quite smooth it over.
They kicked out the prime minister there was a prime minister who tried to tax the minerals industry and spend the money developing the country, and they basically got him tossed out. It's a really bad political washback from having a powerful industry, but that's more controversial. So.
Well, that's interesting. I liked what you said about certain people not getting part of the action, so they lose their jobs and then they can't spend. So I think certainly this is something that basic income helps with. If you have a resource boom in your economy and you're allowing you're kind of handing out money to everyone, they can all participate in the benefit regardless of whether they lost their jobs or something. They can still buy imports and that kind of thing, which have gotten cheaper because your currency appreciated. So basic income, at least it doesn't solve the volatility problem of like if oil crashes, but it at least lets everyone participate in the benefits that are coming to the country. So they're not as localized or specialized or directed towards a specific group or something like that. Let's go to Zach.
So one thing that I wanted to say was just about how the money from other places actually how the foreign money gets whatevered. So when you let's say you have a person selling local bananas and foreign bananas, and they buy local bananas and they're $1, and if you buy a foreign banana, it's $1.25. Now, let's say if the dollar increases in value by twice the amount, now the foreign banana is going to be able to, he can buy twice as many bananas and sell them at a lower cost. And so what happens is that because the currency increases, it makes everything else in the economy more difficult to compete with foreign businesses.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's a great way of looking at it, and it's specifically for tradable goods, right? Because you can't import foreign haircuts, you can't import foreign like fancy restaurant meals and stuff like that. So I like to use the example of local bananas and foreign bananas because that's exactly right. That's the kind of effect you're going to see. So that's really good. Richard, go ahead.
Well, during the California gold rush in the 1850s, and so they were importing food and equipment and things from the East Coast, mainly in the areas around like Boston and New York City and things, and had whoever got their food or tea or whatever to California first had the highest prices and sold it, and they were like $10 per egg in 1850s money, and there were these clipper ships that were that shipped the goods there, and what's
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. If gold is your, whoever finds the gold is going to be able to buy a bunch of stuff, and then the people who don't find the gold are not, and you have some of these similar kinds of disruptive effects, and that's a little bit maybe similar to the dollar story, because if the gold is kind of your money, or if it's what's backing your money, then you're literally exporting the thing that people are using directly as money. So that's interesting too. Let's go to Steve.
But
Yeah,
gold,
go ahead, Richard.
Oh, but people made more money selling things to the gold miners than the gold miners made. So it's sort of an odd example of how.
So you're saying that the gold miners, I'm not sure what that means, because the gold miners are kind of mining money at that point, right? So they're getting money out of the ground. Oh, you're saying in terms of in terms of the work that they put in, they're working a lot harder for the money than they would have to if they were doing something other than gold mining. Is that what you're saying?
And a lot of people never found any gold.
Right. So yeah, so there were a lot of people
who bought blue jeans and things. They bought all this equipment, but the people who are importing and then selling it to the gold miners, they made far more money.
Yeah, that makes sense. You see this, I think, today with cryptocurrencies. So you're probably not going to get rich investing in cryptocurrencies, but you might be able to get rich creating services for people who are investing in cryptocurrencies, that kind of thing. So let's go to Steve.
I'm going to try to make an argument against UBI, because somebody has to. Let's say that Norway makes a lot of oil wealth, and they decide to spread the wealth around, and they do that as a basic income. But then the consumers will be inclined to buy imports rather than the local products, and so the local businesses will become weaker. And by then you're halfway to becoming Venezuela. It seems like rather than a basic income to consumers, you would take your oil wealth and explicitly try to help businesses make their products cheaper. specifically with internal infrastructure, so that the businesses, all businesses can run more effectively, and then the local products become cheaper, and then they can better compete with the imports. And then you don't become Venezuela, because even if the price of oil crashes, you've actually been developing your local economy, so you can survive locally in the meantime.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's kind of what happens with the sovereign wealth funds. Is you take the oil money and you invest in all different industries, and you make sure that those industries are still going. So we can ask the question: to what extent do we want to do that with our available kind of fiscal space, and to what extent do we want to provide a basic income to people? And my feeling is that you'd want to find some kind of balance between the two extremes. So to the extent that other people want to produce stuff for us, that's great. We'd want to find a way to take advantage of that, but we wouldn't want to become dependent on it to the extent that if it stopped, we got into real trouble. So we might want to put resources into maintaining infrastructure, maintaining productive capacity, diversified productive capacity, especially in like the really basic stuff like food and the kind of stuff that you can't do without, or like making sure we're not dependent on things that are specifically volatile, like these kinds of commodity resources and stuff like that. So I think that's a really good point. So the question is, how can we get enough of that kind of redundancy and robustness without sacrificing too much of the basic income and too much of people being able to consume and just buy imports and stuff like that, because that's like almost free stuff, printing money and then handing it out to people so they can buy stuff from other countries, and that sounds great if we can do it responsibly. Yeah, let's go to Nick.
I was trying to think through. I mean, it seems like in some ways the problem that's being described is sort of flows from this foreign exchange, from your currency being overvalued in a way or bid up. But it does seem like basic income funded by printing money naturally counteracts that. Like that is increasing the supply of your currency and should kind of counterbalance that. Is that, I mean, and if so, then I mean, it doesn't directly, maybe it doesn't directly address how the government can ensure the maintenance of a diverse base of production, but doesn't it seems like it counterbalances the effect kind of at the root almost.
So it does feel like basic income might help depreciate the currency. But if you have a monetary policy of keeping domestic prices stable, of keeping your general price level stable domestically, you're still going to have this disparity between the good that you're exporting and the local goods and the tradable goods and that kind of thing. So as long as you're keeping prices stable domestically, the main effect, my thinking is that the main effect that you're going to see on the currency is still this effect from exporting the oil, and the currency is still going to be appreciated. So you can this is kind of what I think it was Steve was getting at before with lowering interest rates, or maybe it was Austin, but you can lower interest rates to kind of increase your domestic price level, so cause some inflation and also depreciate the currency. But then once you stop doing that, you're at a new price level, and the prices of tradable goods are still going to be equivalent across international trade, and you're still going to have a currency that's appreciated in terms of purchasing local goods are going to be more expensive than the tradable goods, and the tradable goods that aren't the ones that you're exporting are going to be harder to export because you can buy really cheap import. So it's hard to be profitable to export them. So I don't know that you could use basic income really to kind of depreciate your currency back to where you would want it to be to kind of cure the Dutch disease. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Soraya, go ahead.
Yeah, this conversation, like I didn't think that it would go on this path originally when I read the article, but this is really good. This is more of a comment, not a question. I guess it's like we're kind of in this right now. We're all stuck at home. The government has given us money, so we can only use like what we have. The only things that we can purchase are these tradable goods, food, paying for our, utilities, staying at home. We can buy whatever we want on Amazon to like, for leisure, and we just kind of have to sit at home. But these things such as like haircuts and, going to like a fancy restaurant, yeah, now those prices are going up because like right now someone would have to like risk, getting corona to come to your home to give you a haircut. You know what I mean? Or if you wanted to get from like that restaurant that not a lot of people could afford, they're not gonna, why would they, what's their incentive to stay open except for to raise their prices? I just feel like I just preliminary, and if I'm making a blanket overgeneralization, I'm sorry, but like I'm looking at Norway and their demographics are pretty flat. Like majority of people are either born and raised in Norway or have Danish, Swedish background, or they're first generation. And that's like, it said like almost like 90%, again, Wikipedia. So, but the US, we're so much more diverse. So now the local banana is not what majority of other people are eating. Like, like my family's Haitian, my neighbors are Asian, people from Africa, people from wherever. It's like we all don't want to eat a banana. Some of us want a pomegranate, some of us want, figs. I don't know, like, whatever. And it's just like, so now, cool, the price for this thing, this American thing stays low, but now when you want that choice and what America's built on, this diversity of like, different cultures, like, that's lost, I feel like. And not to say that UBI would be bad, but again, just like, how do we kind of solve for that? And like, basically, I wanted to bring up what Austin was saying too. He said like Saudi Arabia try to import haircuts, so the foreign people were the ones who but now the income and they're already foreigners, their prices stay low. And it's like we kind of already do that by putting lower educated foreign workers into like these low wage jobs that are like super laborious physically. And it's like, are we just going to kind of fall back into something like that by providing basic income again only to American born or citizens or something? So
yeah, that's a really good point. Turning local goods into tradable goods by importing workers. And I think you're right that if we don't do this right, then we create an underclass of immigrants and immigrant workers, and that's kind of what happens in places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. I think something like 90% of the population of Dubai is migrant workers or something like that. So you can't if you restrict the basic income to citizens, then you risk creating this kind of scenario. So I would want to be very, very careful about that. And I usually advocate not restricting it to citizens, to giving it to everyone who's kind of just in the country. That can be tricky if people are undocumented and they don't want to step forward and register for the basic income or even admit that they're there so that we can find them and give them a basic income, because if we can find them, then we can deport them and stuff like that. So you have to solve these problems too, and it's really not an easy thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, sorry, real quick, because if you say we're going to give it to everyone, then now we're already overpopulated. How do we, solve for that? Yeah. Like I know, like currently the president like can set the standard on how many visas we're going to give, how many refugees we'll accept annually. And I feel like if we were to switch over to like those numbers would lower dramatically, and we'd because like right now the U.S. well before Trump, we accepted immigrants based off of need, like, so it's like if you're coming from a war country, poverty, something like that. If you were being discriminated against because of you're a woman or LGBT, religious persecution, that was our standards. They got priority to come in. Whereas Canada, for example, they take and how they can aid the economy. So now, so people who were, doctors or had doctorates or masters in their country, they get first dibs at coming over for both refugees and immigrants. So now we switch that, it just kind of changes the whole, what is America? Like, what's the definition? So
yeah, if you're offering a basic income to anyone who comes here, then you're paying people to come to America. So that's something to pay attention to. One thing is that I don't think we're overpopulated, and I think this is why Richard raised his hand, and what he's about to say is that we could fit the entire world's population in America if we wanted to. So we have particular cities and such that are overpopulated, but we also have plenty of space, and we could certainly handle the entire world's population in the United States, and certainly we could handle less than that as well. If things kind of went in that direction. Is that what you're going to say, Richard? Go ahead.
We can fit the world's population in Texas. And what I was going to say is that the U.S. can, and certain countries can export their, say, like our entertainment industry with movies or video games and things like that, or like with Silicon Valley and things like that. Like if you're Norway, there's a lot of English speakers in Norway, so you can.
So I'm getting some distortion on your end, Richard.
Oh,
having trouble
really?
hearing you. Yeah.
What did you get or not get?
I think just like right before I said that, there was like a few seconds where I wasn't hearing it, but generally your audio is like crackly a lot and a little bit distorted.
Oh.
It wasn't earlier. Well, you sound okay now, and I think, yeah, go ahead.
So places like Norway, they have a lot of English speakers, so they could do like call centers or something like that, but they probably wouldn't be able to compete with the Philippines or India or AI in a few years.
Yep, I think that's a good point. Yeah, and then we can get into questions about intellectual property and stuff like that. With the call centers, yeah, you can import it, but with like, should we really be charging people to view our movies and stuff like that? That's a whole other question. So let's go to Eddie.
So responding to what Steve and Nick talked about, I actually think that it absolutely would be possible to use UBI to hold your own currency down and kind of sterilize or prevent the appreciation of the currency that you didn't want. So long as people in the country are in fact importing and they're spending some of the money, some of the excess money that they get from UBI, they're spending it on imported goods. The problem from the start is that you are exporting a lot of tradable goods, which generates a lot of demand for your currency. So as a result, your currency appreciates. So this goes back to the currency and foreign exchange policy, and I want to point out two other examples of how countries have dealt with this, which is that Japan and China. Those are two countries that also are very careful the last 10, 20 years not to let their currency appreciate too much. And so what they do is they go into the market and they manage their exchange rate. They sell their currency on the market and they buy up. Right now, they buy up lots of U.S. dollars. They buy up lots of treasuries. And I think it's very interesting to compare the two solutions. On one solution being to have a sovereign wealth fund, which its purpose and the sovereign wealth fund, absolutely, it has to invest outside of the country. It can't invest inside of the country and keep the currency from appreciating. The only way it keeps the currency from appreciating is that it takes the revenues from the oil, say, and it sends it back out of the country, out of the currency, and invests it, in some other country in the world. And so it's interesting to compare the two because, in my viewpoint, with the capital consumption viewpoint, we're dealing with a huge excess of capital in the entire world right now. So right now, that sovereign wealth fund, they're going to be having trouble finding, financial assets in the world that they're going to feel very safe with. And at the same time, China and Japan, they also have this huge potential problem where they have, trillions and trillions of dollars of US treasuries. And if the US dollar were to ever, depreciate, lose value, then they would kind of lose some value with it. Yeah. So I think it might actually be very interesting to use the UBI and to take that, to convert that into consumption rather than assets, because the world in general lacks enough UBI, and the world in general actually needs more consumption. And the capital that is actually not very productive right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, especially about investing in businesses in foreign countries, because then you can ask the question, well, what is it even like? If you're a country and you have a sovereign fund that owns businesses around the world, then what really counts as domestic anymore? You're investing in whatever is profitable in various different parts of the world, and that's all you, right? You're not necessarily constrained in terms of borders, in terms of what you define as being your economy. Did you have more you wanted to say, Eddie? I guess not. So yeah, and then in terms of using the basic income for consumption, I think part of that is right. If China really wants to produce a lot of stuff, and all these countries want to export a lot of stuff, and we print money and hand it out to people, that allows us to import, from these countries that really want to produce a lot of stuff, or from these foreign businesses that want to produce a lot of stuff. I still think, that's good to stimulate the global productive capacity. But again, there's this danger of becoming too dependent on imports. And I don't know that, I don't think basic income alone can solve that problem. I think you do need the investment side of things. So having the sovereign wealth fund, not to generate more money, but to have more control over what your ownership is, so that you can have access to those products and those resources if you're no longer able to import. And maybe you're still, since you're investing in foreign businesses and stuff like that, maybe it still counts as imports technically when people look at it, but you're really buying from a business that you own or something like that. Let's go to Bethany.
Okay, so just a quick thought that's very related to Sarai's comment, which is obviously people also, if they work a service job in a country and then send a lot of that money home, that also affects like this dynamic of what counts as an import, I guess, which is an interesting thing that I thought about when she was talking. But my bigger question is like, I'm starting to think about, practically speaking, what kinds of policies could you implement to mitigate the risk of Dutch disease, or have like productive capacity still sort of waiting in the wings? And I guess you just talked about one, which is just like investing in production elsewhere in the world. Maybe that's the simplest one, but I'm curious if you have, or other people have, thoughts on like, otherwise, how would you nudge things such that you had that capacity waiting and you weren't as susceptible to this problem?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. Investing in production, and we kind of intuitively think that investing in domestic production is the way to go. But who's to say what's domestic and what's not if you have a controlling interest in whatever you're investing in, or you're able to sell your shares in that, or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. What you don't want to do is what you don't want to do is just become dependent on something you don't own, just buying the products without kind of controlling the production, at least to some extent, or being able to influence the production. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So let's go to Austin.
Hey, I didn't think I'd get a chance to shoehorn this into this conversation, but it seems like we've really ended up there. And My whole thing is that we really need a global basic income. I would like to see it layered with like national basic incomes as well, because you wouldn't set the global basic income at the level where it's livable in the United States or Australia, because then it would be wildly inflationary in India or China. But all of this is sort of reminding me, is why, like, I kind of feel like you've got to do that first, because the big inequalities in the world are between nations to a large extent, right? So if you go take the rich world and you throw in a basic income in Europe or the United States or Australia, then you increase that that inequality, and then you get that issue of the immigrant underclass, which is developing in all rich countries. You get the issue of importing too much, because your labor becomes, no one in your country wants to compete with a starving Chinese worker or a Vietnamese worker whose incentive to work for $1 a day is much higher than yours, right? So you get the simulated Dutch disease. You have this issue of low global consumption, which now extends to the point where we've got apparently 250 million people about to starve, right? So to me, the whole thing with the universal basic income, a lot of the difficulties and a lot of the problems that arise from it are solved if it's paid at a global level first, right? And so if you pay it to everyone and it's only $5, $2, whatever a day, it's enough to have a transformative effect on the poorest populations in the world. It's enough to stimulate development in India, China, Africa, Latin America, and sort of actually start drying up the migrant flows to the rich world. You just kind of like, it's kind of like, I don't even want to call it a hack, but it's just like, it's a much more graceful system if everybody really gets it, because we don't really live in national economies anymore. So trying to bring one in a national economy, you come up against all of this friction. So I know your Gresham project idea is basically the idea of a global income. I imagine it being much more tied to like a stronger UN, right? Which at the Bretton Woods conference, before America came in and sort of and took over the whole thing, when the British proposal by John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of his time, was to have a global currency called the Bancor, and that would be the world's reserve currency. And if we'd set it up like that, where the UN was kind of a currency issuer, right, then we'd be in a position to roll out a global basic income in that currency, which would be valuable because it's the world global reserve. And it's so much easier, and it works so much better to think about this thing as a global issue, and then you just cut out all of these problems, and you fix what Eddie was talking about with this global problem of a glut of capital in certain places and no demand for the products of that capital.
Yeah, I think everything you just said is right. We live in a global economy, and the most efficient thing would be to have a global basic income. So the question is, how do we set up the institutions to be able to implement that kind of thing? One thing you could do is, do it through the UN, or you could do it through kind of like an independent Gresham-like thing. Another thing is, one country could decide, hey, now I'm going to start paying out a basic income to everyone in the world. So the United States could unilaterally decide to pay a basic income of $2 a day to everyone in the world if they wanted to. I don't know what level of basic income the United States could sustain if they were doing a global basic income, but it's not zero. So you could certainly start at some level and then see what happens. And I think, if the United States were smart, that's what they would do, or if any other country were smart, that's what they would do.
One more thing I really want to jump at is because people talk about this competition with third world workers. So even if you're only paying it, even if it's only a $5 a day or something basic income, if you give that to people in China, you do a hell of a lot for the workers in the Midwest and stuff who are losing their manufacturing jobs, right? Because you dramatically reduce the competition, the cross-border wage competition, which is hurting those communities. It may even benefit them more than a local UBI at a higher rate.
Yeah, obviously, I think it would be great if we didn't think of people as being dependent on jobs anymore. But yeah, it would have that effect that foreign workers would be less willing to compete with domestic workers if they have money. So let's go to Derek.
Yeah, I was actually going to go in this direction kind of too. I was wondering, to what extent is the import-export problem solved I mean, a way of looking at that is basically by diversifying production, by expanding the network. So we could look at that and say we start top down, we start with let's just make it global to begin with. But I think any network could do this to the extent that it expands and diversifies. Like, can we imagine the euro having the Dutch disease, right? Can the entire European Union get a Dutch disease? Well, there's a lot of different countries in there, so it's kind of unlikely, right? And the same you could say of the US. So in order for us to see these problems, my question is, like, are we presupposing that we're sticking to a small national economy and then trying to figure out a way to make that work instead of finding out a better way to actually accept the fact that we do live in a global economy? And I guess one way to go about that would be to, like, I don't know if you necessarily would have to start by issuing it globally, but just by starting to do this and by allowing more geographic areas to join a monetary network, right? Like, you don't have to just be the global currency issuing it out. You can also be a smaller country that just says, hey, it's in my interest to join this network. That's a way to solve that problem. I don't know. This is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Can you have Dutch disease like between the states in the United States or between the countries in the European Union? Obviously, the European Union as a whole could experience Dutch disease with respect to the rest of the world, but within the individual European countries, it's a little bit tricky because there's actually a lot of tension within the Eurozone. Countries have different needs for monetary policy and fiscal policy and stuff like that. And the fact that they're all tied to the same currency is really limiting them. So then there's the concept of an optimal currency area, like where what area of an economy is useful to kind of like keep locked into the same currency. And for the United States, we've done a pretty good job of that. You can think of the 50 states as 50 different countries, but really from a monetary zone perspective, like we're an optimal currency area for the most part. It's also true that there are some areas of the United States that might go into recession when other areas don't and stuff like that, and that can cause a little bit of tension, but we've really done a much better job of it here than they have in Europe. And I think part of that is that they have a monetary policy that's at the level of the whole Eurozone, and then but the fiscal policy is not at the same level. Each state has to kind of control their own fiscal policy, so they don't really they don't really have as much flexibility in terms of making fiscal decisions, because they're kind of beholden to the European Central Bank, which is at a higher level of the hierarchy, kind of like top down on all of them. Whereas here, the Fed has to pretty much kind of respond to whatever the U.S. government does in terms of their fiscal spending and stuff like that. So the fiscal policy is more in the driver's seat here than it is in Europe. But these are all interesting questions, like how do you get an optimal currency zone? And I don't think Europe has quite succeeded at that. But I think there are things that they could do that would allow them to. And I think you're right that would probably be better. And it would be nice if the entire global economy was an optimal currency area as well. But then you start to have to ask questions like, do we need a one world government, or to what extent do we need institutions that are at the level of the entire international economy, or that kind of thing. So it's interesting stuff to explore, and all of that is related to a global basic income as well. So there's a lot to kind of pick at there. But you guys are giving me some good ideas for future topics, like global basic income and also cultural diversity. Like that was coming up in the chat. I think we'll do one on that. So let's go to Soraya.
You guys are amazing. Like, this conversation is so good. So many things came up. Yes, thank you, Austin, because I think this would have to be delved deeper into, not Austin, sorry, Alex, into like other chats. But I guess like, yes, diversity, I feel like we have to ensure somehow to like not lose that, and like autonomy of different like cultures. I see what Richard just said. He said the pigs, and I'm just like Googling that. And yeah, that's cool, because like different nations can accept like one currency. But I feel like currently, like the European nations, the US, like we're capitalists. So now if we move to this global economy, are we just promoting capitalism throughout the entire world, which is what UBI is, not a capitalist, type of investment or, answers, like in a sense, because if the whole point is to make sure that everyone has like basic needs or like some access to become a consumer. It's not necessarily about capitalism, because capitalism would be promoting you fight your way and you get your top dollar, and now you can have access to resources. That's how I understand the difference between like a UBI society and a capitalist, or UBI economy and a capitalist economy. So yeah, and then again about like the whole, like Austin, I think that's a great idea. Derek, came same thing, like about giving, creating this global currency. I just hate like, and I hate to say this, but like white savior. Now we're saying, oh, the American way is better, so now we need to fix these other countries, because a lot of them are doing better than we are. You know what I mean? Or like whoever comes in now, they're just like taking over, and we're like, blanket, this is the way to do it. And then like think about right now in the U.S. When we're thinking about like power and diversity and like representation, like we're whatever 14 people, 13 people, and it's just like if we all voted for something, who gets more representation in terms of votes? So now if we think about the UN, it's not an equal like 1-to-1, like, oh, this many countries. They also think about what's the population, what do you guys do? So now it's like, how do we ensure that there's a true like democracy when it comes to establishing laws, policies, whatever, about giving out this income and stuff, versus it's just majority rules, and then that's going to go back into like historical racism, classism, socioeconomic, whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about, kind of if America, kind of takes the initiative on this, are we kind of imposing ourselves on the rest of the world? And then is it analogous to kind of global international gentrification or something like that? So yeah, I mean, these are interesting questions. I think it's it feels like there's kind of like the first order stuff of like you're eliminating poverty, making people better off so they can buy things and have the things they need to live decent lives and the freedom to spend their time how they want and all of that stuff. But then there's also these second order concerns, like we're doing all this good stuff. What are some of like the side effects that we want to pay attention to and make sure it doesn't cause some problems? Like you're still overall doing a good thing, but you want to do the good thing as well as possible, almost. You know what I mean? So let's go to Eddie.
So I just wanted to riff off of something Austin said, which was something about how we're, people think about that they're competing for work, against, Chinese or Vietnamese, poor Chinese or Vietnamese workers. And I think it's really interesting if you, can divorce in your head, the concept of income from the concept of work. And if you imagine, the entire world as kind of a big family, if you had a family and today you told all the kids, hey guys, there's no work today, your kids would be like, wonderful. That's great. Let's go to the beach. Or alternatively, if they're bored with the beach, they might say, let's bake a cake, or let's renovate the kitchen. There's, you could always come up with more things to do if there's no work left to do. It's a good thing that there's no work to do. But the problem is that we're kind of stuck to the past, and we've forgotten that these systems are can be designed and can be changed, and you can separate the income from the work. And if there's no work for people to do on a global level, you have to give people income, because you can't just say on a global level, let's renovate the kitchen or let's bake a cake. You have to hand out the money so that people can each individually say, this is what I want done, and then somebody else will step in and say, hey, I'm willing to do that. You can have as much work as you want, as long as you're willing to issue the money to pay for it, which is free. Issuing the money is free.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought, the idea that there wouldn't be enough work for people to do, and that people are kind of competing for jobs and something like that. Because, if you think about it, the labor market is a market for getting people to do something different with their time. if you don't need to get them to do something different, you can let them do whatever they want to do, right? And that feels like something that that we should be happy about, that we should be celebrating if people have more freedom to spend their time how they want. But it's not that way when people are depending on jobs for their income. So basic income really shifts that paradigm. So it's not, you're no longer asking necessarily where are we going to get the jobs from, or who am I competing with to get these jobs in order to survive. It's more, well, I'm living my life, and if someone wants to pay me a lot to do something, maybe I'll do that thing, right? It feels a lot less less competitive and less kind of desperate almost. So let's go to Nick.
I don't know. I can't pull it together. But the discussion a minute ago about, what kind of international cooperation structure could we have to address, I don't know. I was imagining the scenario where the U.S. decides, yeah, we're just starting global UBI. We're sending $2 a day to everybody. If we have a meetup on that topic, it'd be interesting to try to figure out how to explore what might be the downsides for a really poor country of the U.S. deciding to do that. What kind of distortions of their economy, or what kinds of, could it impose a kind of version of this Dutch disease on a country to suddenly, have this happening? Could it put local businesses out of business?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So then you can also ask, what kinds of distortions are there now? Like, is there an opposite of Dutch disease? Is there, a situation where countries are being forced to produce a lot of stuff and export a lot of stuff, and they're doing it and they have to make their own stuff for their own people and export stuff to everyone else. It's kind of like the flip side of the same coin. So maybe sending everyone a global basic income can help pull them back from that and help even things out. So that's kind of one aspect of it there too. Let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, quick response to that. I think there is a lot to explore with this, but when I think about people, having to walk a really long way for water and then doing subsistence farming for themselves, that seems like the opposite, where it's too much local production that's really inefficient compared to what can be done overseas. Those people's time, not that their lives are wasted, they might have very rich, good lives, but in terms of economics, those people's efforts and talents and time are pretty much wasted, in the sense that there's the capacity to farm so much more efficiently than that. And that they just don't have the resources to be participating in that kind of economic efficiency. So, not that I know what it's like to live as them, but in terms of the big picture economic view, it does seem like there's also this opposite problem, right? Of people not having access to using their efforts in ways that could be much, much more efficient if they kind of had access to the broader economy of the world in a different way.
Yeah, that's right. We really, really don't need everyone in the world to be producing their own food. We don't need, countries in Africa to be self-sufficient. Obviously we don't want them to be completely dependent on one source of all the stuff they need. But it's okay and it's good for countries to specialize at least a little bit. So if everyone's growing their own food, that's not a very efficient use of human time. So yeah, I think that's right. If you give everyone a basic income, then that gives people more freedom to specialize and forces them less to be kind of self-deficient. It's okay if we're all interdependent. You just don't want these kinds of single points of failure, that kind of thing. If you're only exporting oil and the price of oil crashes or something like that.
It's the same balance in a way, right? If you're able to support yourself and make your own food, that's resilient in a certain sense, but it's also losing out on all of these efficiency gains. And so
yes.
That to me doesn't seem like the place most people would want to be on the spectrum. There's some middle ground. Yeah.
But I sort of feel like another parallel. If one of the things that people mourn about Dutch disease is, well, I don't know, we haven't talked about this, but it seems like one possible loss on both counts are, maybe I think Soraya was was saying this too. Like, if you lose your local agriculture, you also lose like unique aspects of culture, and people should be able to, or communities, or they should have some choice in that, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think I think that's it's hard, because if you think that like if we just know that there's going to be something that just makes everyone better off, what does it mean to allow people to opt out? Like does that mean like
people might have a different idea of what better off means.
Right. But like there's also people at the individual level and the people at the level of the country, right? So if you're sending everyone individually a basic income, they might be like, I don't want to give up this basic income, but maybe the country doesn't want to be receiving that kind of support from the United States or something like that. And then how do you? I think this is all really difficult stuff to navigate. My sense is that I agree with Bethany and some of the other people here, especially Austin, that sending money to everyone is a good thing, and then these other things are kind of second order issues that we kind of need to grapple with. Anytime things change, even when they change for the better, you kind of need to adapt and help people understand how to adapt and that kind of thing. You know what I mean? Yeah. Let's go to Austin. Austin, you're muted.
There you go. I just wanted to sort of quickly jump in on the back of what Eddie said, respond to his response to me and stuff. It's like, yeah, I agree that we do have this issue of, we want to decouple income from production, and we want to sort of defetishize work and production to a bit, because at the moment there's such an obsession with the idea that everybody's got to work and everybody's got to be productive that is actually counterproductive in a sense intellectually. But and I think one really good example of that is trade wars, right? Like, so at the moment, Australia and China are getting a bit of a trade war going on. The US and China have had one. And what a trade war is two countries yelling at each other, stop giving us so much stuff so cheap, right? That's actually what's happening, is they're both saying, you're giving us too much steel, you're giving us too much barley. And Australia and China are accusing each other of dumping, as in you're dumping all this valuable steel on us. And that then it just destroys our local industry, means we can't get jobs for people making steel, so we can't get them income. So fundamentally, I agree with that. I do think that you want a little bit of nuance about it, because sometimes you want to have local supply chains, so you're not dependent because on outside countries, especially stuff like medicine and face masks and ventilators. We're all realizing you don't want to have all of those supply chains concentrated in just a few places right now. Regarding the benefit to the workers, though, in the US of a global UBI, there's two things apart from the local supply chain, which is a national benefit. The income earned from a manufacturing job, which might otherwise go to China, might be substantially higher than a UBI, just in dollar terms as well. And what I was going to say, one more thing about subsistence farmers and the people sort of, walking a mile, as Bethany was saying, to get water or producing food in these really inefficient ways. They're actually the hungriest people on earth. Most of the people who are hungry are subsistence farmers. And part of that is because they have such low cash income that they have to sell part of their crops to cover other expenses, like, the seed or the fertilizer or whatever, or medicine or some other non-food product. They have to sell their crops, which are only just or not actually sufficient to last them through the year anyhow. So I think, and just as you would see with a global basic income, you would see less international migration, which, by the way, I'm saying is for the benefit of the emigrant countries, not the migrant countries. It's for the benefit of the places that are losing people that you want to slow this down. But you would also have less rural to urban migration, I think. You'd have less people leaving villages and going to cities to try and plug into the cash economy, because there would be a cash economy in the village. So you may actually support some of these small scale farmers, some of this diverse agriculture, with lots of different seeds, and we're not all just having Monsanto monoculture crops. Like, I think the effects are quite complicated. It wouldn't all be homogenization, and in fact you'd be propping up and supporting village economies and subsistence farmers in ways that would be immediately beneficial to them, but may also help them sustain diverse lifestyles, and not just, okay, well, when the kid turns 12, they go off to the city to sell trinkets in the traffic or shine shoes to try and get some cash back to the village.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it's complicated. I think it would make it easier to really sustain any kind of lifestyle. That includes city life or rural life. And my intuition is that people wouldn't necessarily need to move to the city to get their money anymore. But there are other benefits to living near a bunch of other people. There are also costs to living near a bunch of other people if you have a pandemic going on. But my intuition is that, yeah, if you really want to have that rural, subsistence farming lifestyle, then basic income makes that a lot easier. But it might make other things more easier. Like the improvement might be greater for people who are living in closer quarters, can make better use of infrastructure and higher, more scaled up economies, that kind of thing. So I think it's both. My intuition is that you would have less kind of subsistence farming rural economies, because most of the time people are doing that because that's what they need to do to survive. And I think you're right that to some extent people are leaving that lifestyle and moving to the city because they have to. Like, that effect is also, like you said, it's complicated, and we could probably explore that further in future discussions as well. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
It would mean that if people wanted to do that, which was the point that Nick raised, that they could. Whereas at the moment they are literally starving because they're short of cash, not because there's a shortage of food being produced. And even though they're food producers, their lack of cash hurts them and forces them off the land in some cases.
Yeah, whatever you want to do, basic income makes it easier to do that thing. There are people who are being forced to move into the city even though they don't want to, and there are people who are being forced to be subsistence farmers even though they don't want to, and basic income lessens both of those things. Yeah. Let's go to Soraya.
Yeah, lots of questions. We need just a conference, where we go away for a weekend and talk about this. 6 feet away, guys. But I guess, my question's like Eddie, I agree with you. Like, we do have so many resources. It's more, I feel like, again, as a social worker, maybe Ian understands where I'm coming from too, but it's never about here, there's something right there. It's access. These people who live so far away, or a couple weeks ago, Jacqueline, when she was talking about, she has food stamps, but she can't buy anything because the buses don't work. So how does she get to the grocery store? How does she buy that food now that she's stuck at home? So it's not necessarily just give people money and they can access these things. It's now they have the resources to buy whatever, but now they can't access it. So it's and I understand. I'm not saying that UBI is not supposed to be the end all be all, the great savior, but and I do agree it's a step in the right direction. But I guess it's more about, especially this concept of making it global. I don't think that that's gonna work. It's what Austin was just saying. Now you reduce the options for people to continue working. Some of these villages, just think about the way certain societies are. People do have to work. People do have to contribute. And now if you're just oh, sweet, you have money, but it's literally this green piece of paper means nothing in very many countries. You know what I mean? If you aren't, we're imposing our values on them, capitalistic, our economy. It's just if you aren't, certain countries it's about education, other countries it's about producing something. you know? So it's just like this UBI globally, I don't think that, you know, we're there yet. Yeah, I mean, just a lot of things. I still think it's good for us. And I think we need to think about more on this micro level because we know our economy, we know our society. But when we try to think about put this everywhere, again, it just brings me back to like white savior and our way is the best way. So everyone should do this. And it's like, no. But Eddie, like you're completely right. There's so many mansions, there's so many like empty homes that people should be living in. Like, what's the point of having this 3.5 million, you know, on 16 acres of land that is uninhabited that people can only rent? Like, who's making money off of that? Like, what is this waste, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely do one on global basic income, and certainly I would never say that basic income is the only thing that we should be doing. I would say that, you know, governments need to be doing a lot of things for their people, and then basic income is one of the services that is useful to provide. So we're getting to the end. Let's go around and get people's final comments. We'll go Bethany, and then Richard, and then Steve.
Cool. So great discussion. I also really liked the article itself. The side note on this other discussion about global UBI, I guess the one exception I can think of is that there are people who still live in a kind of small scale society way. It's very rare, but there are groups of people who might prefer that to anything that involves kind of like economic transactions because it's a culture that's working and a sort of self-sustaining unit that's working for them. But that's pretty unusual in my knowledge. Yeah, so I liked thinking a lot about this. I guess what I'm still wondering about is, in addition to investing in foreign companies, what are other realistic measures that you could take if you're worried about Dutch disease happening to you in your country? You know, how could you actually maintain capacity? I could talk about that, but like, what would that look like? That isn't just like super wasteful or weird. And would it involve like tariffs and trade wars, or what would it actually look like? And then the other question I have is, this is something that I think a few people also brought up, is like, what protects you from the likelihood of Dutch disease happening in the first place? Like, if you're a larger unit as an economy, like if you're in the United States instead of a small country, is it less likely that you're going to have kind of this one product that dominates all of your other products, or not? Wouldn't get into that super as much, but I'm kind of curious about that as well. Kind of what would create more resiliency against it. So yeah, thanks for a great discussion, everyone.
Great thoughts. Let's go Richard, Steve, and then Derek.
Well, you could create like a 5-year plan or something like they have in China, and put all your resources toward a certain goal, like having a new Silicon Valley or something like that. Like in China, it's quite feasible that they're going to surpass the U.S. like Silicon Valley dominance with AI and things by 2030, and they put all their resources toward that goal, and they're going to gathering all the data that they can, because they don't have the privacy issues and things like that we have in Western cultures. And so if they have all these advantages, and they're putting enough money towards it, then they should be able to do it. But then there's all these issues of like corruption and things. But in the West, we have a lot of, like, particularly in the US currently with Trump, there's a kakistocracy, which is the rule of the worst. And so we're dedicating all the, like with the PPP, getting $27 million to a Trump sponsored airline. That's just
Okay.
the idea.
Yeah, I think corruption is an interesting topic, and we could do one of these on corruption as well. Let's go to Steve, Derek, and then Eddie.
If your monetary policy wants to be centered on consumers, on making sure that consumers get some cash and then are able to get the basic stuff they need, then getting it from imports is okay. But I'm not sure that works for Americans, is currently working for Americans, that importing a lot of stuff is working out fine for the economy. But I don't know that it would work for a country who's like Venezuela, whose currency is not really wanted, is not worth anything to other nations. But for America, importing should be fine.
Okay, yeah. We'll do Derek, then Eddie, and then Nick.
Just sort of, well, to piggyback of what Steve just said, if we do take a consumer-based view, it does, I think, tend to simplify things. I want to learn more about the Dutch disease and how exactly to prevent that. But I think the bottom line for me is that protecting a labor market from Dutch disease effects and protecting the level of basic income you've already achieved from lowering because of a Dutch disease are two wildly different problems. At the end of the day, if more resources are available because we produce them, or if more resources are available because a foreign country is selling them to us for cheap, as far as the basic income is concerned, those are identical. There's more stuff to buy, and so it allows you to give more money. So if we screw up and there's a bit of a Dutch disease thing going on, what that means is you lower the basic income. But that's much less catastrophic than now because you're losing productive sectors, large sectors of your economy, or you're just losing all consumption, right? It's really different from if 20% of your economy suddenly gets no income versus everybody gets a little bit less income. Those aren't even comparable. So yeah, to me, I think that basic income helps us start solving the right problems. And then we can actually learn what effects of the Dutch disease are actually about really losing production that could go to people, real goods that could go to our consumers, and what effects are just kind of like perverse incentives caused by the foreign exchange ratios, that sort of thing.
Yeah, great points. I think basic income simplifies the economy in a lot of ways, and it'll simplify how we think about Dutch disease. If we don't care about people getting incomes from jobs anymore, then you can kind of focus on the problems that remain. Let's go to Eddie, and then Nick, and then Zach.
Just responding to Soraya, I think that with the example of Jacqueline last week, if we put money in her hands, that problem would actually go away. She would actually not have an access problem in that situation where, she would be able to, get an Uber and go to the supermarket and buy what she needs. Many of those are restrictions based on the fact that she has food stamps and not money. I'm happy to talk more about it. So you can find me on Twitter, or you can read the article that I sent a link to. I want to say that that what Austin said about the trade wars and the fighting over who's going to give who super cheap steel, that's hilarious. And if I were a dictator for a day, I would just go crazy with basic income and global basic income to get the currency down, and at the same time say to the rest of the world, to China, if you want to send it, then send it. We're printing dollars and you're sending us stuff. At the same time, also to be conservative, it would be important to use some of those dollars to buy gold reserves and buy foreign exchange reserves. A lot of people have pointed out that the U.S. as a currency issuer, has an unlimited supply of dollars. It can create an unlimited supply, but on the other hand, what the U.S. cannot create is demand for dollars. So you do want to have a backup of gold, foreign exchange reserves, other countries' currencies, and other valuable things, so that just in case, one day your currency drops more or faster than you want it to, that you have something else to sell to create demand for your dollars if the market isn't giving them to you.
Okay.
So yeah, that's all I have to say.
All right, good stuff. Let's go to Nick, and then Zach, and then Martin.
Yeah, great discussion. I think it'd be interesting, or I don't know, we didn't really talk about this, but if the government were going to try to, take active steps to, maintain capacity for like food production or something else that they were worried about, being without in case, in the case that their, the market price for their oil or whatever it was dropped, or their dollars demand dropped for their dollars. And they had a high basic income. I would want to figure out, ideally, they should do that by figuring out a way to make, to promote that, promote that kind of agriculture by making it something people would want to do. I don't know, for fun somehow.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. There are various ways to provide incentives. The obvious one is just to pay people, but maybe there's more efficient ways to get people to do stuff. So let's go to Zach, and then Martin, and then Soraya.
So what I was just struck by was just how complex the global markets are compared to looking at a national. Because you look at the national and the UBI is just easy. It just makes sense. And then you go into the national, and then there's all these new global, and there's all these new problems caused by competing nations against each other instead of cooperating. And going back to what Soraya said, I totally agree, is that the world's might not be ready to really cooperate. And man, we got a lot of ways to go. But really great discussion. I really thank everyone for challenging my mind. Derek, I really liked your last thought, and Austin, you were great.
All right, thanks, Zach. Let's go to Martin, Soraya, and then Joan.
So again, I've sort of listened to the discussion more. Thinking fourth industrial revolution type scenario. So it's been an interesting conversation. Some folks have mentioned subsistence farming and such, and we have this military expression. It goes, "No good deed goes unpunished." So I'd just like to recommend a book titled "Enough: Why the World's Poorest Starve in an Age of Plenty." And one of the things you'll read in the book is how U.S. subsidies for American farmers who are so overproductive that the U.S. Uses opportunities to provide food aid to countries in need. But what that food aid essentially does is knocks out the local farming incentive. So somebody else mentioned, the sort of the complexity of this whole discussion. I don't necessarily expect that, folks are going to pick up this book, but, even if you just sort of Google it, and there's probably a review of the book or a short summary or so. I'm not recommending the book to say it's the best book I've ever read on. I don't mean that at all. I just happened to read it. And my takeaway from the book is both the complexity of dealing with the kind of thing that we're talking about here, where incentives sort of get mixed, and the difficulty of predicting what the outcome of what seems like a good idea. Sometimes the outcome isn't what you would expect.
Yeah, good stuff. We certainly wouldn't want to give people basic income and make them dependent on it and then take it away. That would not be a good outcome. Let's go Soraya, Joan, and then Austin.
Yeah, everyone, thank you. Tonight was really good. Two things I guess I want to finish on. In the article, I know you guys probably can't read that, but it said like when you take 50% of the risk and other companies take 15% tops, it's hard for them to say you're crazy, right? So that was like his response to avoiding the Dutch disease. Like, we're taking more risk. I guess as citizens of this economy, like, how much risk are we comfortable with the government taking with our money, So if, because that's how they combated it. But it's like, so the Norwegian people were confident in their government. Right now, if we took a poll, majority of, citizens are not confident in our government. And then again, with the US the way that it is, a lot of people migrate here because of less government control and intervention in our lives. So now, how much of that are we giving away when we now get universal basic income from them? So just other topics. But thank you and have a great night, guys.
Good stuff. Thanks, Soraya. Let's go Joan and then Austin.
Yeah, thanks. I listened in and I learned. Thanks for the great discussion, everybody.
All right, Austin, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been an excellent discussion. I was thinking we were coming on a really specialized kind of topic this week, but of course it's actually connected to everything else, which I kind of want to finish up, unfortunately, by disagreeing with someone, because Zach was saying that it's simpler thinking about these things from the point of view of the national economy, and that when you bring in the international economy, it gets way more complicated. I think actually, as Dutch disease shows, you're always in a global economy. You're always functioning in a global economy, unless you're North Korea, and even they're exporting their counterfeit Viagra or whatever, right? We're in this situation where you've got Dutch disease issues, trade wars, immigration, all of that. What's the reserve currency? How does that affect your currency? We're in that situation, and given all of that, what Martin raised about subsidies hurting third world farmers, right, is another third level complication from this global economy where you've got wildly divergent levels of productivity and blah, blah, blah. In that situation, I think it's actually way simpler to think about what a global solution produces less downstream complications, because it doesn't exacerbate the differences between countries. So it doesn't create Dutch disease. It doesn't simulate Dutch disease as much as a national UBI might. But yeah, great conversation. I hope we can do global UBI soon.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you make the entire world one country, it simplifies everything. So thanks, guys. This was a great discussion. Next week, we're going to be talking about stimulus, whether it makes sense to think of basic income as a form of stimulus, and even whether it makes sense to think that we should be stimulating the economy at all. What does that mean? So we're going to talk about that next week. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex. Great discussion.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.